In September 1971, behind the cold, thick walls of Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York, a silence was about to be broken. A silence that had concealed years of suffering. Inside, nearly 2,200 men, mostly Black and Latino, were crammed into a space built for half that number, living under conditions that stripped them of their humanity. They were allowed just one shower a week, one roll of toilet paper a month. Their letters from home were often censored or never delivered. Their pleas for basic medical care were ignored. They were treated not as people, but as numbers in a system designed to crush their spirits. But in that brutal environment, a spark of rebellion was kindling. Whispers of resistance spread from cell to cell, fueled by decades of racism, anger, and humiliation. At Attica, 80% of the inmates were men of color, while nearly every single guard was white. This wasn't a place of rehabilitation. It was a pressure cooker of control and despair. By early September, that pressure cooker was about to explode. And all it took was a single mistake. On September 8th, a minor scuffle between a guard and an inmate lit the fuse. Rumors, false rumors, spread like wildfire that the guard had been seriously injured or even killed. The tension became unbearable. By dawn the next day, September 9th, the inmates of D Block decided they had had enough. They overpowered the guards, broke through the gates, and seized control of the prison yard. For the first time in Attica's history, the prisoners were in charge. They took 42 guards and civilian employees hostage, not as an act of random violence, but as leverage for a cause they believed was just. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of descending into chaos, the inmates organized. They established a community within the walls of D Yard. They set up makeshift medical stations to care for the injured, including the hostages. They organized food distribution and formed a security detail to protect their captives from harm. This wasn't a lawless mob. It was a disciplined movement with a clear purpose. They weren't demanding escape. They were demanding to be treated as human beings. They drafted a list of grievances, a manifesto for human rights. As news of the uprising broke, the world's media descended on the small town of Attica. The prison was suddenly the center of global attention, and the inmates knew this was their chance to be heard. They selected a committee of representatives to speak for them, men who could articulate their struggle to the reporters gathered outside. Among them was Elliot L.D. Barkley, a young man whose powerful words would echo through history. Standing before the cameras, he declared, "We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such." His voice, and the voices of his fellow inmates, finally pierced the silence. Their demands were not radical. They asked for fair wages for their labor, an end to racial abuse, and the right to practice their religions freely. They wanted better food, adequate medical care, and access to educational programs. They asked for the right to read books and news in their own languages. These were the basic dignities that had been systematically denied to them. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed like a peaceful resolution was possible. A team of observers, including civil rights lawyer William Kunstler and New York Times columnist Tom Wicker, entered the prison to mediate. They listened to the inmates, carried messages back and forth, and tried to broker a deal with the state. The negotiations were broadcast live, and it looked like progress was being made. But while the world watched images of dialogue and hope, a different plan was unfolding behind the scenes. The governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, refused to come to the prison himself. He refused to meet with the inmates or even the observers. Instead, he saw the uprising as a direct challenge to his authority, one that had to be crushed. While the media focused on the negotiations, state troopers and the National Guard were assembling, armed and preparing for a full-scale assault. The men inside D Yard, holding on to the belief that the cameras would protect them, had no idea of the storm that was about to be unleashed. By the morning of the fifth day, September 13th, the atmosphere inside the yard was thick with exhaustion and fear. The inmates were desperate, but they remained united. They had protected their hostages and believed that as long as they negotiated in good faith, the state would not resort to violence. They were tragically wrong. At 9:46 a.m., the order was given. Helicopters suddenly appeared, roaring over the yard and dropping canisters of tear gas. The thick, choking smoke enveloped everyone, inmates and hostages alike. It was a signal. Panic and confusion erupted as the gas spread. And then, the gunfire began. State troopers and guards, positioned on the catwalks above, opened fire indiscriminately into the haze. Armed with shotguns and high-powered rifles, they fired for nearly 15 minutes straight. Men screamed, scrambled for cover, and fell. The yard, which had been a symbol of defiant hope, was transformed into a killing field. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was deafening, broken only by the moans of the wounded. In the immediate aftermath, the state began weaving a false narrative. Officials told the press that the inmates had panicked and slit the throats of the hostages. This lie was broadcast across the country, painting the prisoners as savage killers who had brought this violence upon themselves. It was a deliberate, calculated deception to justify the state's brutal actions. But the truth could not stay buried forever. The autopsies revealed a horrifying reality. Every single hostage who died had been killed by the gunfire of the state troopers. Not one had been harmed by the inmates. The state had not only killed its own employees, but it had also lied to the world about it. The horror didn't end with the gunfire. After the retaking, the surviving inmates were subjected to brutal reprisals. They were forced to strip naked, crawl through mud and human waste, and run a gauntlet of guards who beat them with clubs and rifle butts. For days, they were tortured and humiliated in acts of vengeful cruelty. The media was barred from the prison. The truth of what happened was systematically suppressed, the official record sealed. For decades, the government denied any wrongdoing, and Attica became a byword for a violent riot, not a state-sponsored massacre. But the survivors never forgot. They carried the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. And slowly, painstakingly, they began to speak out. Through lawsuits and testimonies given years later, they unraveled the official lies and exposed the horrific truth of the assault and its aftermath. Attica was not just a prison riot. It was a rebellion for human dignity. In the chaotic days after the Attica prison uprising, New York state officials painted a grim picture. They called the retaking of the prison a necessary action. They claimed the prisoners were violent, armed, and completely out of control, leaving them with no choice but to use lethal force to restore order. But from within the blood-soaked yard, a different story emerged from the survivors. They spoke of unarmed men, hands in the air, begging for their lives. They described guards beating inmates long after the last gunshot had echoed off the walls. They remembered the bodies of their friends left in the yard for hours, a gruesome warning to the living. And they mourned the hostages, men who could have been saved if the state had only been willing to listen. As families demanded answers and journalists dug for the truth, they hit a wall of silence. Official records mysteriously vanished. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. The truth of what happened during those 5 days in September 1971 was deliberately buried under a mountain of official lies. But even a lie that big can't silence everyone. Whispers of Attica persisted, refusing to die. Persistent lawyers began digging, and slowly, pieces of the real story started to surface. Autopsy reports directly contradicted the government's narrative, proving that law enforcement officers had killed their own men, the hostages they were sent to save. Attica was no longer just a prison. It had become a symbol of profound injustice and the terrifying lengths power will go to hide its own sins. Years turned into decades. The prison was repaired, the bullet holes patched, the bloodstains washed away. But for the men who survived, the memories lingered. Attica never truly ended for them. They carried the trauma of those 5 days inside them, forever haunted by every sound, every scream, and every lie they were forced to endure. Think of Elliot Barkley, the young, articulate man who stood before the cameras, a symbol of the inmates' demand for dignity. He never made it out alive. He was shot during the retake, unarmed, face down on the ground, a single bullet through his chest. He was only 21 years old. But his words, they lived on, echoing through history. We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. Those words became a rallying cry, shouted in other prisons, whispered at protests, and written into songs. Attica had become a message. When you crush people long enough, they will inevitably rise. By the late 1990s, the pressure for the truth became too immense to ignore. Survivors filed lawsuits. Investigators reopened sealed archives. And finally, after nearly 30 years of silence, the real story began to claw its way into the light. Secret memos, hidden photographs, and damning testimony from former officers revealed the cover-up. The retake wasn't a rescue mission. It was an act of revenge. Government officials had ordered troops to shoot unarmed prisoners, knowing full well that hostages were still alive among them. Many who surrendered were executed where they stood. And perhaps most shocking of all, the state had systematically blamed the inmates for crimes its own men had committed. The official story shattered. Attica was in the headlines again, a ghost the government could no longer bury. But justice, when it came, was slow and painfully incomplete. Only a handful of guards ever faced charges, and none were convicted. Most victims' families received quiet financial settlements, but never the apology or accountability they deserved. The prison system itself, scarred but fundamentally unchanged, just carried on. Today, Attica still stands, its walls repainted, its cells refilled. But if you walk those halls, you can still feel the weight of 1971. Every prison reform movement, every fight for prisoners' rights, every protest against state brutality in America traces its roots back to that prison yard. The men of Attica forced a nation to look at itself and ask what freedom really means. Their sacrifice wasn't for nothing. But even now, so many people only know the lie. The history books mention a riot, but not the reasons. They remember the deaths, but forget the demands for human dignity. And that might be the greatest tragedy of all, that the truth of Attica was almost erased, not by time, but by design. 50 years have passed, but the scars of the Attica prison uprising remain. They're etched not just into the concrete walls, but into the heavy silence of those who never saw justice. Can you imagine? Some of the men who died during that brutal retaking were never even properly identified. Their families were left without answers, without closure. Their very names were erased from the official records, as if they never existed. And yet, something powerful happens every September. Survivors and their families gather at the prison gates. They stand together under the same grey sky that once rained down bullets, holding photos of their lost fathers, brothers, and sons. They read their names aloud, one by one. Each name spoken is an act of defiance against erasure. Each voice is a testament that Attica still breathes through the memories of those who refuse to forget. What's truly profound is that some of the guards' families attend these memorials, too. Because the tragedy of Attica didn't just kill prisoners, it broke everyone it touched. The hostages who died were fathers and husbands. The state troopers who were ordered to fire still carry a silent guilt. The state tried to bury the truth, but it could never bury the pain. And as the years stretch on, one haunting question echoes through history. If the real story of Attica had been told from the beginning, how many lives since could have been saved? Today, Attica is both a functioning prison and a living monument to a profound betrayal. Its walls seem to hum with the stories that officials never wanted told. Some guards whisper about hearing voices at night, carried down the long, empty corridors. They say it's not ghosts, but the powerful weight of memory itself. For those who lived through it, the riot never truly ended. It continues in every cell block where injustice is allowed to thrive, in every system that chooses control over compassion, and in every government that fears the truth more than it fears rebellion. The Attica Uprising was never about escape. It was about being seen as human. And half a century later, the world is still deciding whether it will look away again. Then, in 2011, a discovery sent shockwaves through the historical record. A long-lost reel of film, secretly shot by a state photographer during the retaking, suddenly resurfaced. It showed something no one outside that yard had ever seen before: unarmed prisoners waving white flags and shirts, clearly signaling their surrender, just moments before they were shot down. This footage had been intentionally mislabeled and hidden away in an archive for decades. When it finally came to light, it proved what the survivors had been saying all along, that Attica was a riot that simply got out of control. It was a massacre. The film became undeniable proof, a chilling visual record of state-sanctioned violence that officials had sworn never happened. It tore open old wounds and forced the public to confront the horror the government had tried so desperately to bury. For many, it came far too late. But for the survivors who had spent their entire lives fighting to be believed, it was vindication. It was painful, raw, but finally, the truth had a face. Half a century after Attica, the headlines haven't changed nearly enough. Mass incarceration, reports of brutality, prison riots sparked by inhumane conditions. We see different names and different places, but it's the same heartbreaking story. During the widespread protests against racial injustice in 2020, a chant began to echo through the streets once again: Attica, Attica. That word became a powerful symbol, shouted not just in anger, but in solemn remembrance. It was a reminder that what happened inside that prison yard in 1971 was just an isolated tragedy. It was a warning that America has ignored for far too long. The story of Attica wasn't erased. It's still happening, just under new names, new policies, and inside new prisons. And until the system that allows for such injustice is fundamentally changed, that single word, Attica, will remain both a deep-wound and a powerful weapon. 50 years later, the story of Attica still hangs in the air, heavy, unresolved, and unforgettable. For those who lived it, time hasn't dulled the pain. For those who've learned about it, the horror can feel too distant to be real. But Attica is more than just a chapter in a history book. It's a mirror reflecting what happens when power silences truth, when human beings are treated as numbers, and when justice bends to politics. Inside those prison walls, men who had been written off as criminals proved something extraordinary, that even in cages, dignity can't be killed. They built a community out of chaos. They demanded humanity, not mercy. And for 5 incredible days, they made the entire world listen. But after the smoke cleared and the cameras stopped rolling, the system tried to erase them. It tried to rewrite their story, to pretend it never even happened. Yet, every time someone says the word Attica, that effort fails. Because that word still shakes America's conscience. It reminds us that silence can be a form of violence, and that buried truth always finds a way to claw its way back to the surface. The Attica Uprising of 1971 wasn't just a riot. It was a reckoning. It was a powerful cry for dignity from men the world had refused to see. And though decades have passed, prisons all across America still echo with those same voices, the same hunger for justice, the same fight to be heard. You see different names and different faces, but it's the same story repeating itself behind new bars. History doesn't erase itself. We erase it when we stop asking questions. So maybe the real question isn't just what happened at Attica. It's whether we've learned anything from it. Because if we haven't, then somewhere, right now, another Attica could be waiting to happen. Even after all these years, Attica still whispers. Not through the walls, but through the people who refuse to forget. The uprising may have been silenced by bullets, but the truth survived every cover-up, every lie, and every forgotten file. It survived because survivors carried their scars like evidence. It survived because some stories are simply too powerful to die, even when history tries to bury them. Attica was more than a riot. It was a message, a warning. It's a wound that still bleeds through America's prisons today. And if we look closely enough, we'll see that Attica never really ended. It just changed its name. Because wherever there's injustice behind bars, wherever power crushes the powerless, the spirit of Attica still lives on. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of the truth they tried to erase. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more content that uncovers the history we can't afford to forget.